He ignored the homeless woman on his way to work until she showed him a locket with his childhood photo inside. James Harris stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, his eyes scanning the distant horizon of the city's skyline. The setting sun threw long shadows across his immaculate office, painting streaks of orange and pink across the high-rise buildings. But James wasn't really seeing the view. Not anymore. He had seen it every day for the past 10 years, every sunset bleeding into his workday like clockwork. A perfect life. Or at least that's what everyone told him. The partners at the law firm admired his work ethic, his laser focus, and his ability to turn every case into a win. His friends, though few, would tease him about his luxury penthouse, his well-tailored suits, and the latest car he barely drove but kept in his underground parking lot. By all outward appearances, James had mastered the art of success. But beneath the surface of his well-ordered life, a deep hollowness had taken root. He checked his watch, a gift from a client after a particularly grueling case, and exhaled. The long sigh reverberated in the quiet office, but it did little to soothe the gnawing ache in his chest. For years, he had buried himself in his career, convinced that winning another case, securing another promotion, or closing another deal would somehow fill the empty space inside him. It hadn't. The sound of his assistant's voice over the intercom brought him back to the present. "Mr. Harris, your 7 p.m. is here." James blinked, forcing himself to refocus. "Send them in," he replied, his voice calm, authoritative, and void of the emotional storm that churned inside him. Just like every other part of his life, his tone had become another mask he wore, perfectly molded to the man he projected to the world. But behind that mask, James lived in a state of emotional limbo, a place where the past refused to stay buried. No matter how hard he tried to forget, it lingered like a phantom in the back of his mind. The memories were there, hiding behind every case file and each long night spent alone. It wasn't just work that consumed him, it was the need to escape what he could never fully shake off. His younger brother, Samuel. James' hand instinctively moved to his chest, where the familiar tightness always began when thoughts of Samuel crept in. He had perfected the art of suppressing the memories, keeping them locked away in the corners of his mind. But today, they pressed against the walls he had built, harder than usual. Samuel had been only 7 when he died. James was 12. Too young to fully understand the weight of the loss, too old to forget the sound of his brother's laughter, the way Samuel would trail behind him like a shadow, looking up to James with wide eyes full of admiration. And then, in a blink, he was gone. For years, James had avoided looking too closely at those memories, afraid that if he did, the grief would swallow him whole. His parents had grieved in their own way, but their silence in the aftermath had only deepened the emotional distance between them all. No one talked about it. They just moved forward, or so it seemed. His father threw himself into his business. His mother buried herself in charity work. And James had retreated into his own world of achievements, accolades, and superficial success. That was his routine now. He had perfected the art of moving forward without looking back. As he left the office, his steps were as mechanical as they were everyday, quick, efficient, detached. His walk to work, like his life, followed a set pattern. The crowded streets of the city buzzed around him, but he paid no mind to the faces passing by. They were blurs of movement, sounds of chatter and car horns blending into a low hum that he'd long since learned to tune out. He didn't notice the people anymore. Not really. And yet, every day, he passed her. She sat near the steps of the building next to his office, a homeless woman whose presence had become as much a part of his daily commute as the coffee he picked up from the cart on the corner. She was small, frail, her clothes hanging loose around her thin frame. Her hair was matted, streaked with silver and dirt, and her face, though young in appearance, seemed to carry the weight of decades more than her body should bear. James had passed her hundreds of times. Her sign, crudely written on a scrap of cardboard, always said the same thing: anything helps. God bless. He had seen it out of the corner of his eye, just as he'd seen the cup that rested in front of her, waiting for the occasional coin or bill from a passerby. But James never stopped. never acknowledged her. She was a part of the scenery, like the traffic lights, the bustling cafes, or the rows of corporate offices that lined the street. Something he had trained himself to look past, to ignore. The world was full of people with problems, but those problems weren't his. He couldn't let them be his. And yet, today, something felt different. As James approached the spot where she sat, he noticed how still she was, how her head remained bowed, her eyes hidden beneath the shadows of her unkempt hair. For a moment, a flicker of something, guilt, unease, rose in him. It was a feeling he couldn't place, a vague discomfort that made his skin crawl. She didn't look up as he passed, and yet, the weight of her presence seemed heavier today, more tangible. He quickened his pace, pushing the sensation down, smothering it as he always did with any emotion that threatened to surface. When he reached the doors to his office building, he paused, glancing back toward the woman. For a brief second, he thought he saw her look up, her eyes catching his with an intensity that sent a cold shiver down his spine. But it must have been his imagination. James shook his head, dismissing the feeling. He had no time for distractions, especially not now, when the emptiness inside him felt closer to the surface than it had in years. With one last glance over his shoulder, he turned and entered the building, his mind already shifting back to the safety of work, where the ghosts of the past couldn't follow him. But something told him, deep down, that those ghosts were not finished with him yet. The morning air was crisp, the kind that stung the lungs and jolted the senses awake. James moved through the city streets like a man on autopilot, his mind already shifting gears to prepare for the day's workload. He had a client meeting in less than an hour, followed by a lunch with a potential new partner and a never-ending stream of paperwork waiting on his desk. He liked it that way, busy. Too busy to think. Too busy to feel. The rhythmic click of his polished shoes against the pavement was a comforting sound, a reminder of his steady pace and control. But as he turned the corner, passing the same buildings he did every day, his eyes landed on her again. The homeless woman. The one with the cardboard sign. James's gaze flitted over her as usual, and for a second, he prepared to keep walking, as he always did. But something held him back. She wasn't sitting the way she usually did, slouched, eyes downcast, as though she were a shadow of herself. Today, she sat upright, her thin frame almost rigid, and she was looking directly at him. James faltered, just for a moment, his breath catching in his throat. Her eyes, they were piercing, dark, hollow, but filled with something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't anger, nor was it desperation. It was recognition. Like she knew him. He blinked, shaking off the sensation. This was ridiculous. She was just another person, another face in the sea of anonymous city dwellers. And yet, there was something about her stare, something unsettling in the way her gaze seemed to cut through the layers of indifference he had carefully constructed. He had walked past her 100 times, if not more. Why should today be any different? But it was. He could feel it. As if propelled by some force outside of himself, James reached into his pocket and pulled out a few crumpled bills. He didn't even know why he was doing it. He had never given money to people on the street before. It was a rule he'd made for himself long ago. If he gave once, he'd feel obligated to give every time, and that wasn't something he wanted to deal with. But today was different. Without a word, he dropped the bills into the cup in front of her. The woman didn't say thank you. She didn't even look at the money. Her eyes remained locked on his, unwavering, as if she were waiting for something else from him. The silence between them stretched, thick and charged, and for the first time in years, James felt exposed, vulnerable, even. A knot tightened in his chest, and he hurried away, his heartbeat quickening in his ears. As he walked, his mind raced. It wasn't the act of giving that unsettled him. It was the way she looked at him, the way her gaze stirred something deep within him, something he had long buried. Samuel's face flashed in his mind, unbidden and unwelcome. His little brother, always smiling, always following him around. James had been his hero back then, his protector. But in the end, James had failed him. His throat tightened, and he shook the memory off. He had no time for that.
Not now.
Not ever. But the woman's eyes, they haunted him. When he arrived at the office, he was greeted with the usual pleasantries, but his mind remained distracted. He powered through the day, throwing himself into meetings and phone calls, but a nagging sensation clawed at the edges of his thoughts. By the time the sun had begun to dip below the horizon, he was no closer to understanding why the encounter had shaken him so deeply. It was just a woman. A stranger. He had no reason to feel this way. And yet, as he left the office that evening, his thoughts drifted back to her. The way she had looked at him, there was something familiar about it, something that gnawed at the back of his mind, though he couldn't place it. For the first time in a long time, James felt truly unsettled. He thought about passing her again tomorrow. Would she look at him the same way? Would she say something this time? Or was this all in his head? He walked back to his apartment in silence, his usual calm shattered by the echo of her gaze in his memory. When he entered his penthouse, the silence of the space seemed to press in on him from all sides. He tried to shake the feeling, to remind himself that it didn't matter, that she didn't matter. But that night, sleep eluded him. The following morning, James was more irritable than usual. He had spent the night tossing and turning, his mind spinning with thoughts he couldn't control. The homeless woman's face appeared in his dreams, always staring, always silent. He couldn't understand why it was affecting him so much. He arrived at his office early, hoping to distract himself with work, but nothing seemed to stick. His mind kept wandering back to her, to those eyes, and to the strange sense of recognition that lingered just beyond his grasp. By the time he left the office for lunch, he was already dreading the walk past her. But when he rounded the corner, she wasn't there. He paused, looking at the empty spot where she usually sat. His chest tightened, a confusing mix of relief and disappointment surging through him. Why did he care whether she was there or not? As he was about to move on, a flicker of movement caught his attention. Across the street, she stood near an alleyway, watching him. For a moment, James considered walking away, but something inside him urged him forward. He crossed the street without thinking, his heart pounding louder with each step. When he reached her, she didn't say a word. Instead, she held something in her hand, a small, tarnished locket. James frowned, confused. Slowly, she opened it, revealing the tiny photograph inside. It was him, a younger version of him, no older than 10, standing next to a boy with a wide grin and curly brown hair, his brother, Samuel. James felt his stomach drop. The world around him seemed to tilt as he stared at the photo. How was this possible? How did she have this? His heart thundered in his chest as he looked from the locket to the woman, who stood there, silent and unmoving. What is this? His voice came out as a whisper, rough and strangled. The woman looked at him, her eyes soft but filled with something James couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe. "We need to talk," she said quietly. Her voice was raspy, as though she hadn't used it much in recent years. "I knew your family." James' heart stopped. His mind screamed that this couldn't be real, but the locket in her hand told a different story. Suddenly, the air around him felt thick, suffocating. Memories long suppressed surged forward, threatening to overwhelm him.
Samuel. His death.
The things they never spoke about. James stared at the woman, his mind reeling. "What do you mean? You knew my family?" he asked, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to stay calm. The woman lowered her gaze for a moment, her expression unreadable. "There are things you don't know, things you were never told." James' blood ran cold. How could she possibly know anything about his family? And yet, the photograph in that locket proved that she did. He took a step back, his pulse racing. "Who are you?" The woman hesitated before answering, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was there when it happened. When Samuel died." James felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him. The tightness in his chest intensified, and he could barely breathe. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But deep down, he knew that whatever she had to say next would change everything. James stood frozen in place, his mind swirling with 1,000 questions, but none of them came out. He could only stare at the woman, this strange, disheveled figure clutching the locket that held a piece of his childhood. A piece he had tried so hard to forget. She held the locket out toward him, the metal glinting in the faint morning light. For a brief second, he hesitated, but something in him, the part that had never healed from Samuel's death, reached for it. His fingers brushed the cool metal, and as soon as the locket was in his hand, a flood of emotions hit him like a tidal wave. The picture inside was unmistakable. James could never forget that day. He and Samuel were standing by the old oak tree in their backyard. It had been their favorite spot to play, just the two of them, hidden from the world. He could still remember Samuel's laughter as they raced toward the tree, his younger brother always a step or two behind, but never giving up. The photograph was faded, but James could still make out the details. The way Samuel's curls were wild and unruly, the gap in his front teeth as he grinned up at the camera. And James, with his arm draped protectively around his brother's shoulders, smiling in a way he hadn't in years. But the woman's presence shattered the nostalgia. His thoughts raced with questions, impossible questions. Why did she have this locket? How could she have been there when Samuel died? And why had his family never mentioned her? The woman's voice broke through his thoughts. "You don't remember me, do you?" James shook his head, struggling to find his voice. "No, I don't. How do you have this?" His voice cracked, the emotional weight pressing down on him. She sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly, as if the burden of her words was too heavy to bear. "I wasn't always like this," she said quietly, gesturing to her worn clothes, her ragged appearance. "I used to know your family. A long time ago." James's throat tightened. He didn't want to hear this. He didn't want to believe that some stranger, some woman he had passed by without a second thought for years, had been part of his life, his family's life. He shook his head, stepping back. "This doesn't make any sense. You couldn't have known them. My parents would have told me. I would have remembered." The woman's eyes softened, filled with a sadness that made James's heart ache in a way he wasn't prepared for. "They didn't tell you because they didn't want you to know. They were trying to protect you." "From what?" James's voice was sharp, his frustration rising. "Protect me from what?" She took a deep breath, her gaze never leaving his. "From the truth. About Samuel. About what really happened." James's heart pounded in his chest, his palms sweaty as he gripped the locket tighter in his hand. "What do you mean, what really happened?"
He died.
"He drowned. That's what happened." The woman flinched, her face twisting in pain. "Yes, he drowned, but there's more to the story. Things your parents didn't want you to know. Things they kept from you." James felt as though the ground beneath him was slipping away, as if reality itself was unraveling. His entire life, everything he thought he knew about his family, about his brother's death, was being called into question by this woman. This woman who had been nothing but a ghost on the street to him until today. "I don't understand." His voice was softer now, more broken. "Why would they lie to me? Why would they hide this from me?" The woman's eyes brimmed with tears, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Because they were trying to spare you the pain. They thought they were doing what was best for you. But in doing so, they buried the truth. And I've been carrying the weight of that truth for years." James's mind raced, trying to piece together what she was saying. "You were there when it happened."
How?
"Who are you?" She swallowed hard, her eyes darting to the ground for a moment before meeting his gaze again. "My name is Claire. I used to work for your family. I was a nanny. Samuel's nanny." James's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't heard that name in years, but it struck him like a lightning bolt.
Claire.
The name was familiar, but distant, like a half-remembered dream. He had vague memories of her, blurry images of a younger woman with kind eyes who used to take care of him and Samuel when their parents were busy. But she had left, disappeared from their lives without explanation. His hands trembled as he held the locket, his mind struggling to process the revelation. "You were his nannies?" She nodded, tears now spilling down her cheeks.
"Yes."
"I loved him like he was my own. But after the accident, your parents sent me away. They didn't want me around anymore. They didn't want me to tell you what really happened." James's breath caught in his throat. "What really happened? Claire, you need to tell me the truth. What did my parents hide from me? Claire hesitated, as if the weight of the secret was too much to bear. But finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. The day Samuel drowned, I was supposed to be watching him. But I wasn't. I wasn't paying attention. And when I realized he was gone, it was too late. James felt the world tilt beneath him, his vision blurring with shock and anger. You let him drown? Claire shook her head frantically, her voice breaking. I tried to save him. I swear I did. But it was too late. When your parents found out, they blamed me. They said it was my fault. And maybe it was, but they didn't want you to know. They didn't want you to grow up hating me. So they made me leave. They buried the truth. James staggered back, the locket slipping from his hand and clattering to the ground. His whole body shook with the force of the revelation, his mind reeling from the implications. His parents had lied to him. They had made him believe that Samuel's death was just a tragic accident, an unavoidable loss. But all this time, there had been more to the story. And Claire, this woman who had been a part of their lives, had been erased from their history. I don't, James's voice faltered, his chest heaving as he struggled to breathe. His whole life felt like a lie. Everything he had known, everything he had believed about his family, was crumbling around him. Claire knelt down, picking up the locket and holding it out to him once more. I've carried this for years, she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want to burden you with the truth, but I couldn't live with it anymore. I had to tell you. You deserve to know. James stared at the locket, his vision blurring with tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in years. He felt betrayed, shattered by the weight of the truth. But deep down there was something else, a flicker of understanding, of realization. His parents hadn't just lied to him. They had lied to themselves, too. They had been trying to protect him from a truth that was too painful to face. But now, he couldn't avoid it any longer. He took the locket from Claire's hand, his fingers trembling as he held it close. The photo of him and Samuel stared back at him. A reminder of the brother he had lost and the past he could never truly escape. I need time, James said quietly, his voice barely audible. I need time to figure this out. Claire nodded, her face streaked with tears. I understand. But please, James, just know that I never wanted to hurt you. I loved him, too. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving James standing alone on the street, clutching the locket that had shattered everything he thought he knew. James stood in the same spot for what felt like hours, his mind numb from the shock. The world around him moved in a blur, the constant hum of traffic, the chatter of passers-by, the everyday sounds of the city, but he felt utterly disconnected from it all. The locket in his hand felt like a lead weight, tethering him to the ground as the enormity of Claire's words sank in deeper and deeper. She had been there. She had been a part of their family. She had carried this secret, this unbearable truth, all these years while he remained in the dark. And his parents, the two people he had trusted most in the world, had deliberately hidden it from him. The ache in his chest was overwhelming, twisting tighter with each breath. James closed his eyes, trying to push away the storm of emotions rising inside him. Grief, anger, confusion. They all churned together in a chaotic spiral, threatening to pull him under. How could they have lied to him like this? How could they have erased Claire from their lives, from his life, and let him believe that Samuel's death was a tragic accident without any deeper explanation? It was like his whole childhood, his whole understanding of his family, had been built on a foundation of lies. He turned away from the street and began walking, his legs moving on instinct alone. His office was only a few blocks away, but he couldn't go back there, not now. Not with this weight pressing down on him. He needed to think. He needed space. But more than anything, he needed answers. The weight of Samuel's loss, which had always lingered in the back of his mind like a dull ache, now roared to life with an intensity that scared him. His hands trembled as he slipped the locket into his coat pocket, as if keeping it out of sight would somehow dull the pain it had brought to the surface. By the time James reached his apartment, he felt as though he had walked miles. He didn't even remember the journey back, his thoughts too tangled to notice the world around him. The moment he stepped through the door, The suffocating silence of his penthouse greeted him. Usually, it was a sanctuary, a place where he could retreat from the pressures of work and the demands of his carefully constructed life. But today, it felt like a cage. The memories of Samuel, once distant and fragmented, flooded back with crushing clarity. James found himself pacing the length of the living room, his chest tight with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. His mind kept circling back to the same questions. Why? Why had his parents lied? Why had they sent Claire away? What other secrets had they kept from him? His eyes fell on the bookshelf in the corner, where family albums and photo frames were arranged neatly alongside his legal textbooks and law journals. He hadn't looked through those albums in years. The last time he had was after his father passed away, a reluctant gesture of mourning that hadn't given him any real sense of closure. At the time, he had felt disconnected, numb to the grief. But now, something pulled him toward those old photos, as though they might hold the answers he was desperately seeking. James crossed the room and pulled down the largest album, his fingers trembling slightly as he flipped open the worn cover. The first few pages were filled with pictures from his childhood, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, family vacations. Each image showed a smiling family, perfect and whole. But as he turned the pages, searching for something, anything, that might explain the truth about Claire and Samuel, his heart sank. Everything was so carefully curated. Every photo seemed to reinforce the same narrative. They had been a happy, normal family. But he knew now that wasn't the whole story. As he turned to a page that showed a picture of him and Samuel side by the old oak tree in their backyard, the same image from the locket, his chest tightened. His fingers hovered over the photograph, the weight of the locket in his pocket growing heavier with each passing second. He remembered that day so clearly now. It had been one of the last good days before Samuel's death. Before everything changed. A wave of guilt surged through him. Guilt for forgetting, for moving on, for bearing the pain of his brother's loss so deep that he had almost convinced himself it wasn't real. But it was real. And Claire had been there. She had seen it all. She had lived with the weight of his family's secret while he had walked through life, ignorant of the truth. The thought was unbearable. James closed the album with a snap, his pulse quickening. He couldn't sit here, drowning in memories and unanswered questions. He needed more than old photos. He needed to confront the truth head-on. His parents had buried it, but there had to be someone who knew more. His first thought was his mother. She had always been the more emotional one, the one who wore her heart on her sleeve, at least before Samuel's death. But he hadn't spoken to her in months. Their relationship had become strained after his father died, their conversations stilted and formal, as though they were strangers navigating the remnants of a once-close bond. He doubted she would tell him the full truth now, not after all these years. Then his mind turned to someone else. His Aunt Margaret. She was his mother's older sister, and though she had always kept her distance from family matters, James remembered her presence during the time after Samuel's death. She had been there, watching from the sidelines, always with a knowing look in her eyes. If anyone knew the truth, it would be her. Without another thought, James grabbed his phone and dialed Margaret's number. The line rang for what felt like an eternity before she answered, her voice crackling through the receiver with a faint note of surprise. "James? It's been a while." His heart pounded in his chest as he gripped the phone tightly. "Aunt Margaret, I need to talk to you. It's about Samuel." There was a long pause on the other end, and James could almost hear the tension in her silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, more hesitant. "What about him?" I found out something," James said, his voice shaking. "About the day he died. Claire, the nanny. She told me she was there, that she wasn't paying attention and that my parents sent her away. Why didn't anyone tell me about this?" Margaret's silence stretched on for a few moments, long enough for James to wonder if she had hung up. But then she spoke again, her voice laden with sadness. "Your parents, they were trying to protect you, James. They thought it would be easier if you didn't know the full story." "What full stories?" James demanded, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "What else haven't I been told?" Margaret sighed, the weight of years of unspoken secrets heavy in her breath. Your mother, she couldn't handle it, James. Losing Samuel broke her in ways I don't think you've ever truly seen. She couldn't bear the thought of you blaming her, or yourself. So she and your father made a decision. They thought it would be better for you to believe it was an accident, something that no one could have prevented. But it wasn't, James whispered, his throat tight with emotion. Claire said she wasn't watching him. It could have been prevented. I know, Margaret said softly. But your parents needed to believe otherwise. They needed to believe that it wasn't anyone's fault. And they needed you to believe that too. They didn't want you to carry that burden. James sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. The truth was both devastating and infuriating. His parents had lied to protect him, but in doing so, they had robbed him of the chance to truly understand what had happened to his brother. I don't know what to do, James murmured, his voice thick with grief. I don't know how to deal with this. Margaret's voice was gentle, comforting in its familiarity. James, there's nothing you can do to change the past. But you can choose how you move forward. You can confront it, face the pain, and try to understand why your parents did what they did. And maybe you can forgive them. James swallowed hard, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. Forgiveness felt like an impossible task at that moment, but deep down, he knew Margaret was right. He had a choice to make. He could stay angry, lost in the betrayal, or he could try to understand. I'll try, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Margaret's voice softened even further. That's all you can do, James. Just try. When he hung up the phone, the weight of the locket in his pocket felt different. No longer just a symbol of betrayal, but of the complicated, messy love his family had tried to protect him with. He wasn't sure if he could forgive them yet. He wasn't sure if he could forgive himself. But for the first time in years, James felt the stirrings of something new. Not peace, exactly, but perhaps the beginning of it. The next few days passed in a haze for James. The locket remained tucked in his coat pocket, a constant, unrelenting reminder of the revelations he had uncovered. He avoided phone calls from his mother, unable to face her with the truth still so fresh and raw in his mind. He didn't know how to begin a conversation about the lies, the secrets, the betrayal. He wasn't sure if he ever would. But there was one thing he knew for certain. He couldn't let this rest. Claire's presence, her confession, had shattered the carefully constructed reality James had lived in for so long. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that avoiding her, avoiding the past, was no longer an option. There were still too many unanswered questions, and if he didn't get those answers, the weight of it all would suffocate him. He decided to find Claire again. The idea felt daunting. He didn't even know if she would be there, sitting in the same spot by the office building, but something told him that she would. She had carried the truth for so many years, waiting for this moment, and James needed to confront her, truly, this time. He needed to know everything. Not just the truth about Samuel's death, but also what had happened afterward. Why had she fallen into this life? How had things spiraled so far from what they once were? The morning air was thick with the threat of rain as James walked the familiar route to his office. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of dread and anticipation swirling in his stomach. He tried to focus on the sounds of the city, the routine of the morning commute, but his mind kept returning to the weight of the conversation that lay ahead. When he approached the spot where Claire usually sat, he saw her immediately. She was hunched over, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her thin frame seeming even frilier than before. Her presence felt heavier today, more tangible, as if she were bracing herself for what was to come. James hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach her. But then, with a deep breath, he stepped forward. She looked up as he neared, her eyes meeting his with the same intensity that had unnerved him days before. But this time, there was something different in her gaze, something softer, more vulnerable. She didn't say anything as he sat down beside her on the cold concrete step. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The noise of the city hummed around them, but it felt distant, almost muted in the tension that hung between them. Finally, James broke the silence. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" His voice was quiet, but there was an unmistakable edge of pain in his words. Claire's eyes dropped to her hands, her fingers twisting together nervously. "I didn't think you'd want to hear it," she said softly. "After what happened after your parents sent me away, I thought it would be easier for you if I stayed out of your life. I was afraid that telling you the truth would only make things worse. Worse than living a lie." James's voice was sharper now, the bitterness he had been holding back finally slipping through. "I grew up believing Samuel's death was just an accident, something no one could control. Do you know what it's like to find out that's not true? That all this time, there was more to the stories." Claire winced, her face contorting with guilt. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I should have told you. But after your parents cut me out of their lives, I didn't know how to reach you. I lost everything, James. I lost my job, my home, and in the end, I lost myself too." James stared at her, the anger simmering beneath his skin mixing with something else, something more akin to pity. He had never considered what Claire's life must have been like after Samuel's death, after his parents cast her out. It hadn't occurred to him that she might have suffered, too. "Why didn't you fight back?" James asked, his voice quieter now, more conflicted. "Why didn't you try to clear your name? If it wasn't your fault, why didn't you tell someone?" Claire looked up at him then, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I didn't fight because I blamed myself. I still do. I was supposed to be watching him, James. I was the one responsible that day. If I hadn't turned my back for those few moments," her voice broke, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, trying to hold back the sob that threatened to escape. "If I had been more careful, maybe Samuel would still be here." James's throat tightened as he watched her struggle with the weight of her guilt. It mirrored the guilt he had carried all these years, the unspoken sense that he, too, had failed his brother. He had been the older one, the protector. But he hadn't been there for Samuel when it mattered most. "Do you really believe that?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you really believe it was your fault?" Claire shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't know. I've spent years replaying that day in my head, trying to figure out what I could have done differently. But it doesn't matter now. What matters is that your parents needed someone to blame, and I was the easiest target." James's heart ached at her words. He hadn't thought of it that way before. His parents had been desperate for an explanation, for someone to hold accountable for the unbearable loss of their youngest son. And Claire had been the one who bore the brunt of their pain. "I'm sorry," James said quietly, surprising himself with the words. "I'm sorry they did that to you." Claire looked at him with wide eyes, as if she hadn't expected an apology, certainly not from him. "You don't need to apologize, James. None of this is your fault." But James shook his head, his voice tight with emotion. "No, but I should have known. I should have asked more questions, looked for answers instead of just accepting what I was told." They sat in silence for a long time after that, the weight of their shared grief and guilt settling between them like a tangible force. For the first time, James allowed himself to truly feel the pain of losing Samuel, not just as a distant, tragic memory, but as a wound that had never fully healed. And for the first time, he allowed himself to feel the complexity of Claire's role in his family's history, understanding that she, too, had been a victim of the tragedy. After what felt like an eternity, James finally spoke again, his voice low and steady. "I need to know everything, Claire. I need to know what really happened that day." Claire's eyes filled with sorrow, but she nodded. "I owe you that much." She began to speak then, her voice trembling but determined. She told James about the morning of Samuel's death, how she had taken the boys to the park near their house, as she had done so many times before. She described how Samuel had been so full of energy that day, running ahead of them, always eager to explore. She had taken her eyes off him for just a few moments, just long enough to answer a phone call, to turn her attention away from the water's edge. And then, in an instant, he was gone. She had heard the splash, had run to the water's edge, but by the time she reached him, Samuel was already submerged. She had jumped in, had tried to pull him out, but it was too late. His small body had already gone limp in her arms. James listened in silence, his heart breaking all over again as the reality of that day sank in. He had imagined Samuel's death 1,000 times in his mind, but hearing it from Claire, hearing the raw, painful details, made it all too real. When she finished, Claire sat back, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "Your parents couldn't bear it," she said softly. "They couldn't bear the thought that it could have been prevented. So they blamed me. They told everyone it was an accident. They didn't want you to grow up knowing that someone was responsible." James's chest tightened. The pieces were finally falling into place, and with them came a crushing sense of grief. His parents had tried to protect him from the truth, but in doing so, they had created a different kind of wound, one that had festered in the years since Samuel's death. "I wish I could change it," Claire whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I wish I could go back and fix everything. But I can't. And I've been living with that guilt every day since." James closed his eyes, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He had spent so many years pushing the pain of Samuel's death aside, but now that it was in front of him, he couldn't ignore it any longer. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the locket, holding it in his hand as if it were a lifeline. "He was always so full of life," James said quietly, his voice breaking. I never thought I would lose him." Claire nodded, her tears falling freely now.
He loved you so much, James.
"You were his hero." The words hit James like a punch to the gut, and for the first time in years, he let the tears come. He wept for his brother, for the years of pain and guilt, and for the truth that had been buried for so long. Claire sat beside him, her presence a quiet reminder that they were both carrying the weight of the same loss. When his sobs finally subsided, James wiped his eyes, his voice hoarse. "Thank you," he whispered, "for telling me the truth." Claire gave him a sad smile, her eyes filled with empathy. "You deserve to know." James nodded, the weight of the locket still heavy in his hand. "I don't know what to do with all of this," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I don't know how to move forward." "You start by forgiving yourself," Claire said gently. "And maybe you can find it in your heart to forgive your parents, too." James didn't answer right away. Forgiveness felt like an impossible task, but deep down, he knew Claire was right. The past couldn't be changed, but it could be understood. And maybe, just maybe, there was a way to heal from it. As he stood to leave, he turned to Claire one last time. "I want to help you," he said quietly. "You don't have to live like this anymore." Claire looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "You don't have to do that, James." "I want to," he insisted. "It's the least I can do." Claire nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." As James walked away, the rain began to fall in soft, steady drops, washing over the city like a quiet promise of renewal. For the first time in years, James felt something shift inside him, something that felt like the beginning of healing. It wasn't closure, not yet, but it was a step toward it.
And that was enough for now.
The days that followed James's conversation with Claire were a blur of conflicting emotions. He threw himself into his work as he always had, but the familiar rhythm of his legal cases and meetings no longer held the same power over him. The cracks in his perfectly structured life had widened, and no amount of distraction could seal them. At night, he lay awake, replaying Claire's words, her sorrowful gaze, and the overwhelming sense of guilt that had lingered between them. Yet, through the fog of confusion, a new resolve had begun to take shape within him, one that whispered of redemption, of forgiveness, not just for Claire, but for himself. One cold, gray morning, James found himself sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of untouched coffee cooling in front of him. His mother's number blinked up at him from his phone screen, the same number he had been ignoring for days. His stomach twisted with the weight of everything he hadn't said. But he knew this was a conversation he couldn't avoid forever. It was time to confront the truth with her, just as he had with Claire. With a deep breath, he tapped the screen, bringing the phone to his ear. It rang twice before his mother's familiar voice answered on the other end. "James, I've been calling," she said, her tone filled with concern. "Are you all right?" For a moment, James couldn't find the words. His throat tightened, and the silence stretched between them. But then, before he could second-guess himself, the words spilled out. "I know about Claire," he said, his voice more steady than he had expected. "I know what really happened with Samuel." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by a long pause. "James," his mother began, her voice soft, hesitant. I didn't know how to tell you. Your father and we thought we were protecting you." James swallowed hard, the familiar ache of betrayal rising in his chest, but this time it was tempered with understanding. "Protecting me from what?" "From the truth. From the guilt," his mother whispered. "You were just a child, James. We didn't want you to grow up blaming yourself, or Claire, or anyone. We thought it would be easier if you believed it was an accident, if you didn't carry the weight of what happened." James closed his eyes, leaning back in his chair as the pain of her words washed over him. "I was already carrying that weight, Mom," he said quietly. "Even without knowing the whole story, I've been carrying it for years. You didn't spare me anything. You just made me feel more alone." His mother's voice broke, a soft sob escaping her. "I'm so sorry, James. We thought we were doing the right thing, but we didn't realize how much it would hurt you." For the first time, James allowed himself to feel her grief. He had been so focused on his own pain that he hadn't truly considered the depth of hers. His mother had lost a son, just as he had lost a brother. She had made choices out of desperation and fear, not malice. "I don't know if I can forgive you," James admitted, his voice trembling. "But I think I can try." There was another pause, and when his mother spoke again, her voice was filled with relief and sorrow all at once. "That's all I can ask for." They spoke for a while longer, the conversation tentative, but open in a way it hadn't been in years. By the time James hung up the phone, a small part of the tension that had been coiled inside him for so long had eased. It wasn't a full release. There were still wounds that needed time to heal, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, James began to take small steps toward reconciling with his past. He visited his parents' home, the house he had grown up in, for the first time in years. His mother greeted him at the door with tearful eyes, and though their conversations were difficult, they began to rebuild the trust that had been lost so long ago. It was a slow process, fraught with moments of tension and sadness, but there were glimmers of hope, two small, fragile moments of connection that felt like a balm to old wounds. But James knew that his journey toward healing wasn't just about his family. It was about Claire, too. He couldn't shake the image of her sitting alone on the cold city streets, weighed down by her own guilt and grief. The thought of her carrying that burden for so long, without support, gnawed at him. So, one afternoon, he sought her out again. When he found her, she was in her usual spot near the office building, but something had changed. She looked thinner, more worn than before, as if the weight of their previous conversation had taken its toll on her. But when she saw him approach, her eyes softened, a faint glimmer of recognition and hope in them. "James," she said quietly as he sat beside her. "I didn't expect to see you again." He gave her a small, tentative smile. "I wanted to see how you were doing. I've been thinking a lot about what you told me, about Samuel and about you." Claire shifted slightly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I told you everything I know. I don't have anything else to give." James shook his head. "It's not about that. I've been thinking about how we left things. About how you've been living like this for so long, carrying all that guilt. You don't have to keep living like this, Claire. You deserve more than this." Her eyes flickered with doubt, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I don't know how to change it. I don't even know where to start." James reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, a list of shelters and support services he had researched over the past few days. He handed it to her. "This might help. There are places that can offer you a warm bed, meals, maybe even a fresh start." Claire stared at the paper for a long moment, her fingers trembling as she held it. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't deserve this." "You do," James said firmly. "You've been through enough. And I don't think Samuel would want you to live like this. He loved you. We both did." Her tears came then, spilling down her cheeks as she tried to hold back a sob. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," James said gently. "Just let me help you. It's what I should have done a long time ago." They sat together in silence for a while after that, the weight of their shared pain hanging in the air between them. But there was a sense of peace, too, a quiet understanding that they were no longer alone in their grief. Over the weeks that followed, James helped Claire navigate her way toward stability. It wasn't easy. The road to recovery was long, and there were days when she resisted, when her shame and guilt threatened to pull her back under. But James didn't give up on her. He visited her at the shelter, helped her find resources, and, slowly but surely, watched as the woman who had once been lost began to find her footing again. In helping Claire, James found something within himself, too, something he hadn't expected, a sense of purpose. He had spent so many years locked in his own pain, focused only on his own success, that he had forgotten what it meant to truly connect with others. But now, with Claire, he had found a new sense of compassion, of empathy. He wasn't just healing from his own wounds, he was helping someone else heal, too. And in that, there was a kind of redemption. One afternoon, as they sat together outside the shelter, Claire looked over at James, her expression thoughtful. "You know, you've done more for me than I ever thought anyone would. I don't know how to thank you." James smiled softly. "You don't need to thank me. I'm just glad I could help." Claire nodded, her gaze drifting to the sky. "I think Samuel would be proud of you." The words hit James in a way he hadn't expected. He hadn't thought much about what Samuel would think of him, of the man he had become. But hearing those words from Claire, he felt a warmth spread through his chest, a quiet sense of peace. "I hope so," he said quietly. As the afternoon light faded and the sun dipped below the horizon, James realized that for the first time in years, the tightness in his chest, the constant ache of loss, had eased. He wasn't fully healed. He wasn't sure he ever would be. But he was no longer trapped in the past, no longer defined by the pain he had carried for so long. He had found a way forward. And in that, there was hope. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and a distant promise of winter as James made his way down the familiar gravel path. His steps were slow and deliberate, his mind quiet but reflective. He had made this journey before, many times in fact, but today it felt different, weighted with meaning, yet somehow lighter than it had in years past. Ahead, the old cemetery came into view, the gray headstones standing like sentinels amidst the golden and red hues of the trees that surrounded them. He hadn't visited in a long time. It had always been too hard, too painful to stand in front of Samuel's grave and confront the reality of his brother's absence. But today, James felt ready. As he reached the small, weathered headstone, he stopped, taking a deep breath to steady himself. The name etched into the stone had once felt like a scar, an open wound that refused to heal. But now, as James gazed down at the simple inscription, Samuel Harris, beloved son and brother *, there was something different in the way his heart responded. There was still sadness, still the ache of loss that would never fully go away, but alongside it was something new. A sense of peace, of acceptance. He knelt down, brushing away a few stray leaves that had gathered at the base of the stone. "Hey, Samuel," he said quietly, his voice soft and steady. "It's been a while." The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment, the silence of the cemetery felt almost sacred, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to speak. "I don't even know where to start," James continued, his hand resting on the stone. "I've spent so many years trying not to think about you, trying to move on without really facing what happened. But I was wrong. I think I've been carrying this weight for so long because I didn't want to let you go. I didn't want to accept that you were gone." He paused, the familiar lump rising in his throat, but he didn't fight it this time. He let the emotions come, allowed himself to feel the grief, without pushing it away. "I found out the truth," James said, his voice thick with emotion.
About what happened that day.
"About Claire and why Mom and Dad kept it from me. I was angry at them for a long time, for keeping me in the dark. But I think I understand now. They were just trying to protect me. They were grieving, too." He closed his eyes, letting the memories of his brother wash over him. The way Samuel's laugh had filled their house with light, the way he had followed James everywhere, always eager to be part of whatever adventure his older brother was having. The memories were bittersweet now, but they no longer felt like knives twisting in his heart. They were part of him, part of the love he would always carry for Samuel. "I'm sorry, Sam," James whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry I wasn't there for you. I've been carrying that guilt for so long, but I think I'm finally ready to let it go. I think it's time for me to forgive myself." The words hung in the air, and as they did, James felt something inside him shift, something long buried finally being released. The guilt that had consumed him, the grief he had tried so hard to suppress, began to lift, making room for something new. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of something softer, acceptance, maybe even hope. He stayed by Samuel's grave for a while longer, talking to his brother as though they were still sitting beneath the old oak tree in their backyard, sharing secrets and stories like they used to. When he finally stood, there was a sense of closure that he had never thought possible. As James made his way back down the gravel path, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm golden light over the cemetery. He felt lighter than he had in years, as though the burden he had been carrying for so long had finally been lifted. He couldn't change the past, but he could move forward, and that was enough. Over the next few months, James's life began to take on a new shape. The walls he had built around himself, the emotional distance he had maintained for so long, began to crumble, piece by piece. He reached out to his mother more often, their conversations growing warmer, more honest. There were still difficult moments, still unspoken wounds that would take time to heal, but the foundation of their relationship was slowly being rebuilt. And then there was Claire. James had kept his promise to her. With his help, she had moved into a women's shelter, where she had access to support services that helped her regain a sense of stability. It hadn't been easy. There were setbacks, moments when her guilt and shame threatened to pull her back into the darkness, but she was stronger than she had given herself credit for. Slowly, she began to reclaim her life, piece by piece. One afternoon, James met her at a small cafe near the shelter. She had been living in transitional housing for a few weeks now, and he could see the difference in her. There was a new light in her eyes, a strength that hadn't been there before. As they sat together, sipping coffee and catching up, Claire looked over at him with a thoughtful expression. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how I deserve more than this." James raised an eyebrow, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I still believe that." Claire nodded, her gaze drifting out the window for a moment before returning to him. "I want to start over. I want to find work, get my own place. I want to build a life again." James smiled, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "I think that's a great idea." They sat in silence for a moment, the warmth of the cafe wrapping around them like a blanket. Claire's journey was far from over, and James knew there would still be challenges ahead. But the fact that she was here, that she was choosing to move forward, filled him with hope. "I wouldn't have gotten this far without you," Claire said softly, her eyes filled with gratitude. James shook his head. "You did this, Claire. I just helped you see that you could." She smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'll never forget what you've done for me, James." "Thank you." He nodded, his own eyes stinging with emotion. "I'll never forget what you did for me either. You told me the truth when no one else would. You gave me back a part of my past that I thought was lost." They sat together in the fading afternoon light, their connection no longer defined by guilt or grief, but by a shared understanding of what it meant to heal. They had both been broken by the past, but together, they had found a way to piece themselves back together. Months later, on a quiet, sun-dappled morning, James found himself back in the park near his office. The same park where he had passed Claire so many times without ever really seeing her. But now, the park felt different, brighter, more alive. It was a place of beginnings, not endings. He stood by the bench where he had first stopped to talk to her, where everything had changed. As he watched the people around him, families with children, couples walking hand in hand, he felt a quiet sense of contentment settle over him. His life wasn't perfect, and there were still days when the grief of losing Samuel crept up on him. But it no longer consumed him. It no longer defined him. He had found peace in the most unexpected places, in the truth, in forgiveness, and in the people he had once thought he could never understand. As he turned to leave the park, James paused for a moment, his eyes drifting toward the horizon where the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light over the city. It was a new day, and with it came the promise of hope, of healing, of new beginnings. And for the first time in years, James felt ready to embrace it all.